welcome to The Law Matters. Of course it does. Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. As we tell you, this program was created to educate, inform, and help you with law matters because the law matters. A better understanding of the law puts you in a better position to decide how to help yourself, your family, and at times your business with various law issues. In each segment, we try to provide information and resources that may help you decide whether or not you actually need to contact a lawyer. If you do decide to contact a lawyer, perhaps these resources will be helpful. Our goal, of course, is to have you be prepared and to achieve the best possible outcome while saving time and money. The Bizarre and Associates law firm in East Providence continue to provide information, experience, and insights on the various topics that we cover. And as always, we want to welcome and thank once again Attorney David Bizarre, who continues to give us his insights, his wonderful anecdotes, and here we go. So today, it's actually a very recent news headline that launches our discussion. A Colorado lawsuit against former President Trump's eligibility went from being a long shot, was in a state court, to suddenly being in a Supreme Court. And as of March 3rd, which is just a few days ago, it was decided that he must remain on the ballot, despite his role in the January 6th, 2021 attack on the U.S.Capitol. How did that happen? Someone decides at the state level that there's going to be an issue that they're going to raise, and there are several other iterations of it, and it ends up in the Supreme Court, which brought to mind what are the jurisdictions of the U.S. Supreme Court? What kinds of cases do they handle? How did they get there? What about state and federal courts? What are the differences between them, and how does it matter to you? So let's do a little bit of a tutorial. This isn't meant to be a political show, but here we are from a state court, a district court, and eventually a Supreme Court. So where do we want to start? How about, how did we get there?
So it's not a political show, it's a show about the law, and this is a legal issue, and it's a legal discussion as to what courts have jurisdiction over what types of cases. So to take the case that you used as the example to open the show, that case was brought in the Colorado state courts, and the trial level court in Colorado decided that there was an action that former President Trump took that would have been such that he would have been removed from the ballot, but they found that the constitutional question that was an issue under the 14th Amendment didn't apply to his office as president at the time he took that action. And that decision was appealed to the Colorado Supreme Court. And they reversed on the question of whether or not it applied to his office as president, finding that it was an office of president as contemplated under the 14th Amendment, and therefore he could be removed from the ballot. That was then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the question is, does the U.S. Supreme Court have jurisdiction over that type of question? And the answer is yes, because they're interpreting a federal law, in fact, in this case, the federal Constitution, and the Supreme Court has the U.S. Supreme Court has final decision-making authority on federal questions.
That's a very good, succinct review. Thank you for doing that. It was interesting that when, Maine and Illinois had their own separate issues, but it was Colorado, and the defeat in Colorado wasn't not in a district court, but in the Supreme Court. And then, as you said, it ends up getting fast-tracked to the U.S. Supreme Court. As we talk about the state and federal courts, the rocket dockets and how things get to be fast-tracked, it's a very interesting process. It didn't seem that it took very long for it to go from state to district to now the U.S. Supreme Court. Why did that get fast-tracked? That might be a political question, but it might not be.
Well, It is and it isn't. But let's talk about generally how cases get to the U.S. Supreme Court. If it's a case that started in the federal system, U.S. District Court, which is the trial level, that case is then tried in front of a U.S. District Court judge and perhaps a jury. And after that case has been decided, it can be appealed to the Circuit Court of Appeals for whatever circuit is the home of that district. And that appeal is heard usually by 3 judges. And if that decision is not, either side doesn't like that decision, they can ask for the entire circuit, it's called en banc, to review it. It's not required, it doesn't always happen. And if they don't get that or don't like that, that can then be appealed by a writ of certiorari to the U.S. Supreme Court. And what happens with those cases is, I don't know how many thousands of cases are appealed by a writ of certiorari to the U.S. Supreme Court, but they take very few. And they're not required to take them, it's discretionary, and the U.S. Supreme Court justices review the writ and they vote on whether to take it, and I believe 4 have to vote in favor of taking a case by writ of certiorari. And if they do take it, it's then docketed and then set for an argument, oral argument and briefing, and then a decision's made. And it can take a long time.
And yet, in this case, it didn't take a long time. But of course, I guess they must have they of course understood, never mind the media pressure about it and the timeliness of it, it had impact on so many levels. And while I didn't mention it, I guess it was mentioned that even if the U.S. Supreme Court did not expressly mention the decisions in Maine and in Illinois are likely to be reversed in light of what's going on. So that one decision wasn't just about what was going to happen in Colorado and that his name's back on the ballot, but so is it in other places, and it probably will squelch others now because they know that the states don't have that right. That's a Congress issue rather than it being some arbitrary state saying, I think we don't want him on the ballot.
So, 2 things. First of all, the question that you asked was, why was it heard so quickly and decided so fast? And the answer is they recognized that they had to make a decision because it was really about his name being on the ballot for the primary. For the primary, yes. And that was coming up. And so there was a date that they had to get that decision done by so that it could be determined whether or not his name would be on the ballot. And so that's why it was done so quickly. And then the second part of the answer to what you asked is the case has impact on these other cases because they decided, and it was 9-0, but not for all the same reasons, but that each state shouldn't have sort of like, I think they called it a patchwork ability to take a person, any person, off of a ballot that will affect other states. So since it was a national election president, the states don't have the right, according to that decision, to make that determination as to who cannot be on a ballot.
Sounds good. So now that we've addressed that particular issue, and you did it very thoroughly, and we talked about the state and the federal courts, let's backpedal just a little bit and talk about the federal versus the state courts. What are the differences? And the word jurisdiction comes up. Please explain.
Right. So federal courts have jurisdiction primarily over cases that involve a federal law, statute, or constitution. Criminal cases can be brought in federal court for violations of federal law, federal law, and civil cases that involve federal law, patent, whatever it might be, can be brought there. But also, there is jurisdiction for other civil cases that are called diversity cases. And what that is, are cases that may involve state law only, because if it involves federal and state law, you can bring it in either state or federal court. But if it's just state court, you have to bring it in a state court unless there's diversity. So what happens is either the plaintiff can file in the first instance in federal court and claim that it falls under the diversity rules, which are that all of the plaintiffs, if there's more than one, and all of the defendants, if there are more than one, are from different states. And the amount in controversy or that's being sued for or that's at stake is more than $75,000. And if you have those factors, you can either bring it in federal court in the first instance, or if someone brings it in state court, the defendant can ask to remove it to federal court.
So the plaintiff gets, if there's a choice to be made, he gets first dibs?
Yes.
And then the defendant
can decide,
also decide.
Yeah, if you brought it in state
whatever.
court in the first place, the defendant can ask that the case be removed to federal court.
What about state courts? What's their jurisdiction? State
Court jurisdiction is, in the first instance, mostly, usually, about state issues. So if it's a criminal case, a violation of a state statute, state law. So typically, let's just say you have a charge where someone's charged with murdering somebody, you'll find that that is brought under the state statutes, criminal codes. And there could be also federal cases brought for those same actions. And if you remember, I think it was the defendants in the George Floyd case were brought in state court, Minnesota, if I'm correct. Does that sound right? Mm-hmm. But also there were federal charges brought against those defendants as well. So you can be charged in both courts with different violations of the law, but for the same actions. The state courts also have jurisdiction over claims for civil things that are typically brought under state rules and laws, such as a personal injury case. You're injured by someone's negligence, and it was in, say, Rhode Island or Massachusetts, and the defendant and the plaintiff are from Rhode Island or Massachusetts, if that's where it's brought, or a business contract or those types of things are usually jurisdiction in the state court.
Someone robs a bank in a state. Someone robs a bank that's in a state, but it's a federal bank. Mm-hmm. Does that automatically turn it to federal, or is that a situation where you have an option? Yeah,
so and people often ask, why are some cases brought in federal court and some cases brought in state court? And these are criminal cases we're talking about right now.
Yes.
And so the answer to that is, it depends really who's bringing the charges, who was the law agency that investigated the case. And I'm often asked about some political corruption cases that were brought. So there was a governor in Rhode Island who was prosecuted in state court, Governor Dupree, and there was a mayor in Providence, Buddy Cianci, who was prosecuted in federal court. And the reason was that the state police were the ones primarily investigating what the governor did, and therefore brought those charges. But the FBI was investigating the mayor, Buddy Cianci, and so they brought their charges under federal violations in federal court.
When the FBI is involved, does that automatically make it a federal case?
So yes, if they're going to find that you violated a statute, they're investigating federal issues.
Interesting. So how are the state courts set up? How are the federal courts set up?
Okay. So state courts are different, or can be different in each state. In Rhode Island, for example, there's district court, which has jurisdiction over misdemeanors.
Such as?
In the first instance, domestic violence, DUI, cases that might be theft but under a certain amount, things that don't rise to the level of a felony. So a misdemeanor in Rhode Island would be something that has a penalty under a certain amount or a fine, and a prison sentence under a certain amount. I think it's 1 year. And so they have jurisdiction over that, and they have jurisdiction over small claims cases on the civil side, and a concurrent jurisdiction with Superior Court up to, like $5,000 to $10,000 concurrent perhaps, or if it's more than a certain amount, then it's Superior Court for civil cases. Superior Court has the right for, if you have your trial in the first instance for a criminal case in district court, and you don't like the result because there's no jury, you waive it in the first instance, you can appeal that to Superior Court for a trial de novo, meaning brand new. And your case starts all over with the right to have a jury if you want it, and or to be heard by a judge. And in criminal cases, Superior Court has first jurisdiction or original jurisdiction over felonies and cases that are over the threshold for district court. Those cases can be appealed to the Supreme Court. Some state Supreme Court. Some by a right of appeal, and other cases by a writ of certiorari.
Which is?
Discretionary on whether or not the Supreme Court will take it. It's an appeal or a writ of certiorari saying, you really need to hear this case, here are the reasons why, and then the court will decide whether they will take it or not. So, for example, another trial level court in Rhode Island is workers' compensation, injuries that occur during the course of your employment. So if the injury arises out of your course of employment, you bring that case to the workers' comp. They hear the case. If you want to appeal, there's a workers' comp appellate division that'll hear it. Then if you want that case to go to the Supreme Court, it's by writ of certiorari.
We've used from time to time, or referred to, even when we've touched upon this topic in the past, friend of the court, amicus briefs. When someone is trying to appeal and thinks that they have a very good reason to, what kind of weight, explain what an amicus brief is and what kind of value or possible impact does it have? It happened with this case with President Trump, former President Trump too, but.
So if a case is appealed to the Supreme Court of either a state or the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's a case that has wider impact than just those people who are involved in the litigation, because typically in appeal, the appellant writes a brief, the appellee writes a brief, and that's it. And then the court will hear arguments and decide it on those briefs and those arguments. But if it's a case that has wider impact, and there can be a lot of different types of cases that would, the court will entertain or ask for briefs from friends of the court, amicus briefs. And those might be other folks that have an interest in the outcome of this decision, not in the case itself, but how the court might decide the case.
So the courts ask for the amicus brief, or someone volunteers and hope it is accepted by the courts?
Both.
Both, okay.
Both. The court, Rhode Island Supreme Court might have an issue that impacts the administration of justice, and they might ask for different areas of the law associations, the Rhode Island Association for Justice, to write a brief, or the other groups that might have an interest in that. And so they'll solicit it and say, if you're interested in writing a brief, we're interested in hearing from you. It could be, for example, a case on the unauthorized practice of law, and they might ask the Rhode Island Bar Association to weigh in on that, as opposed to I believe in this other case, other groups, the one you were talking about with the appeal from Colorado, may have asked the court for permission to file an amicus brief.
And then they will decide.
The court will decide whether they'll accept it or not.
The federal court system now.
So the federal court system, as we said, the trial level in the most cases is the U.S. District Court for whatever district that your case might arise out of. And then again, it's an appeal to the Circuit Court of Appeals, and then writ of certiorari to the Supreme Court. However, there are also other lower level courts or trial level courts in the federal system. There's a bankruptcy court for bankruptcy petitions, so there's specialized court to hear those types of cases.
Let me just ask a follow-up about the bankruptcy. Bankruptcy court, does it matter the amount of the bankruptcy, or whether it's for business versus an individual?
So there
Same
are
court.
different chapters that someone can file under, an individual versus a business, and what type of filing it's going to be. So you've often heard of Chapter 7 filings, Chapter 13, Chapter 11. Those relate to whether or not it's a complete liquidation or a reorganization of your debt,
Yes.
and whether it's a business or an individual. So those types of cases are specific to the bankruptcy court. Then there's a court of claims, which might hear claims against the government, or there's actually a vaccination claims that are heard. So if someone's injured by a vaccination, they have set up a fund to pay people who have been injured by a vaccination so that they can be compensated through that court of claims.
Is that a recent?
It's been around for a while.
Issue? Oh, okay.
It maybe became more well-known when people were concerned about the COVID vaccination. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of vaccinations that can cause injuries, but we want, the society wants people to be encouraged to take those vaccinations, but they want them to be compensated. It's my understanding that the drug companies that make the vaccinations, when they get paid, a certain amount of that money that's paid is paid to this fund. And, you know, I've had cases, a client who had Guillain-Barré
Yes.
As a result of
Yes.
the vaccination, and he was able to be compensated for the injury that he incurred as a result of having the vaccination.
That's a very specific kind of court, isn't it,
Very
David?
specific.
Okay.
Yep. And the last one I can think of federally would be the tax court for issues involving the tax code.
And that's federal?
Federal. Yep, U.S. tax code.
So do you expect that that's going to be expanding if they're adding to the ranks of employees who are going to be checking the IRS returns?
No, I don't think it. I think it's been around forever when they've had a lot of agents checking them and then fewer.
Okay. Had to ask, of course. Yeah. So we mentioned earlier that people have the choice of going to state and federal courts in some occasions. So let's talk about what some of those differences might be. Time and money being two things that we like to save our viewers. Let's discuss that a little bit. The expense of federal versus state court cases. Comment?
So it really shouldn't matter that much, depending on the type of case, whether it's brought in state court or federal court. The fee shouldn't be impacted that much. I will say this, that the federal court dockets are smaller, and therefore they usually are heard quicker. So the lawyer has to be prepared to start his case and finish his case in a much shorter period of time.
Interesting. So of the things that I had been reviewing, we've spoken about the process, the issue of discovery, which you can go into. Often that would make a difference in the expense of state versus federal court cases, where and to the extent that discovery comes into play, that may impact as a single issue on the cost and the time of the case. Care to comment? What is discovery first?
It depends on the type of case, whether it's going to impact the fee. I'm thinking in terms of perhaps a personal injury case where there's diversity and it got appealed to the federal court. It shouldn't impact the fee because it's usually a contingent fee. But an hourly fee, it can impact that. In discovery, in federal court is going to be compressed. It's still sort of the same system, which is interrogatories and depositions and all of the types of things you might do, requests for production, to get all the information you need to try your case. But the time frame is going to be compressed in federal court as opposed to state court. So
is it true that the discovery process doesn't occur until after they go through the pleading of claims and all that? And how does that impact on the rest of the case and the cost of going through discovery if you don't have to do that until after the case is pled?
Well, what that means by after the case is pled is you bring your complaint first.
Yes.
And you serve your summons, and then the defendant has time to answer, usually 20 days, something of that nature.
Good to know.
And they file their answer. And they could file a counterclaim, and then you have time to reply to the counterclaim. But that's the pleadings. Okay. And once the pleadings are done, then you can begin your discovery.
We mentioned earlier, and I guess it was the case with this Trump issue going to the U.S. Supreme Court, the concept of a rocket docket. Where does it fit in?
Yeah.
Explain what it is.
So I consider federal court to be a rocket docket as opposed to state court anyway, because it is faster. But I think what you're referring to is more on the Supreme Court side of things, where there are some kinds of cases like this where they will expedite the hearing to get an answer out. And a lot of courts will do that depending on the situation and what needs to be decided. Most cases, if it's a suit over money and that type of thing, there are other things that play a factor in how quickly that case may or may not get decided or settled, which is interest on any judgment that might be found, the jury might award.
Another point. Of course, yes, you're a lawyer, but whenever there's a long and protracted case, you may not be charging by the minute, but if it's going on for months, you are charging by the minute.
Yeah.
But of course, honestly, if something is going to take a long time, lots of disputes, we can see how easily that would impact on the overall cost to someone who's...
It can add up if it's an hourly fee.
Good to know. If you are working with someone and they're at the point of, is this going to be a state or a federal case, would someone see you before that's been determined, or would someone see you and you would talk them through the pros and cons of each?
Right. Usually that's part of the decision you make as an attorney when you discuss the case with your client. Some things you have control over, as we talked about, some things you don't. So if it's a civil case, you will have some control over whether it's state or federal, because you can decide what you want to bring your complaint on, what type of law you want to decide to bring it on. If you have a choice, you might have a case where you can bring it on federal law, or you might be able to bring it on state law, and therefore you have control whether it might be state or federal.
And so would you be counseling someone as to where their best shot at having the optimal outcome would be?
Yes, that factors in very much so. So you will be also factoring in the speed at which the case is going to get heard and resolved, who you might draw as a judge, what the federal system might be in terms of a jury pool versus the state. So those are all kinds of things that would factor in a civil case. In a criminal case, you have no control over where it's brought, because it's brought by the investigating agency or the law enforcement agents.
So as we always say, we try to help our viewers so that some things they could handle on their own. Does it seem reasonable or even possible that someone who has been charged with a crime would be able to have some insight as to whether they should go to a state or a federal?
They don't have control over that.
They don't.
No.
But they also wouldn't have insight as to how long the docket is, how...
No control, on the criminal side, no control over any of that, because it's who brings the charges and where they bring them. And in terms of a lawyer...
You did say that, yes.
In terms of a lawyer, if it's not a misdemeanor, if it's a felony,
yes, okay.
You actually, if you can't afford a lawyer, as you may have heard on TV, one will be appointed for you.
Good to know. Good to know. We hope that this has been helpful to you in having a better understanding about court systems. And as we say, we try to provide some information to you. U.S.Courts.gov is one website that you might consider using, and also justice.gov. We thank you for tuning in to The Law Matters. As we say, stay tuned. It matters to you.